Good morning, Gordon College. I am Nicholas Rowe, Associate Vice President for Student and Global Engagement here, and it is my privilege to be your host for this last convocation for this fall semester. Let us begin with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for making this day. We thank you, Father, for your promise of life and wholeness for every one of us. And I pray very, very specifically, Lord, for your anointing on our speaker, that you may speak through him, and that according to your promise, your words will not return empty, but accomplish the purpose for which they have been sent. We ask these things specifically in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Gregory Thompson. He is a pastor, scholar, artist, and producer whose work focuses on race and equity in the United States. He serves as executive director of Voices Underground, an initiative to build a national memorial to the Underground Railroad outside of Philadelphia, research fellow in African American heritage at Lincoln University, a historically Black college, and James Lawson Fellow for Faith and Justice at Historic Clayton Temple in Memphis. He is a co-creator of Union, the musical, a soul and hip-hop based musical about the 1968 sanitation workers' strike, and the co-author of the forthcoming Reparations, A Christian Call to Repentance and Prayer, coming out from Brazos in 2021. The title of his talk this morning will be called Love in the Streets, the Faith-Based Civil Rights Movement and the Contemporary Church. Without further ado, I hand it over to our convocation speaker for this morning, Dr. Gregory Thompson.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe, and hey, everybody. It's great to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person. I fear that's not the last time we're going to say that in the coming months. As Dr. Rowe said, my topic with you today is the faith-based civil rights movement and the contemporary church. And the reason I want to talk about that, they're probably obvious, but I'll tell you anyway. Obviously, culturally, we're in the midst of an extraordinary time where not only is there kind of widespread distrust in democratic institutions, we're also in the midst of a pandemic, but various forms of inequality are being protested in a way that we haven't seen in a really long time in this country. And so it's an extraordinary time to be talking about these things. I'm also wanting to talk to you about this because of issues on your own campus. I know that a lot of you have struggled with racial tensions and injustices, and there's deep institutional dissatisfaction from students. And this is just an important time for us to be talking together about what does it mean to be a community that lives in a time such as this and does it as Christian people. And the last reason I really want to talk about this is because I personally believe that the American Christian church's continual, historic and continual sheltering of various forms of inequality is one of the greatest missionary challenges that we face, and one of the primary reasons that the gospel lacks public integrity in this culture. And I'm convinced that it does like that. And so, based on these things, I'm asking the question: what does it mean for the people of God to be present in this moment? What does it mean for people of God who follow Jesus in this world to move into this world as we find it? Now, in asking this, I obviously want to look to the scriptures in my own life. As Dr. Rowe mentioned, I'm a pastor, and I'm a Christian. I want to look to the scriptures, look to our theological traditions, broadly speaking. But in my own life, I found it really helpful to look to historical examples. And so when I did my Ph.D. at the University of Virginia, I did that on Martin Luther King, and have really spent the past 20 years trying to understand the faith-based part of the civil rights movement and how it's a model for us, or to the extent that it is. And so I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about what King's vision was for a faith-based civil rights movement anchored in an ethic of love. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about King and that vision. I'm going to pull up some photographs that I want to show you. So just give me one moment as I do. Here we go. Now, when you think about Martin Luther King, what do you think? What images come to your mind? Some of you will think of him as a young man in 1955, as he is here. He's just 26 years old, standing up to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. Some of us will think about him as a young man in 1956, standing in a house outside the Montgomery bus, kind of basking in the triumph of the Montgomery bus boycott. That's what's happening in this photo. Some of you may think of him as the conflicted leader in the midst of the freedom rides, when he's being confronted by the freedom riders for not participating in that. Some of you will probably think about him in 1963, standing at the Lincoln Memorial, surrounded by thousands of people. His arms are outstretched, speaking about his dream. Some of you may be thinking about him peering out from the cell in Birmingham later that year. And this is a famous picture I know lots of you have seen. Some of you will probably think of him in 1964, standing before the King of Norway, receiving the Nobel Prize. Some of you will think of him in 1965 as he led the long march from Selma to Montgomery. He was leading thousands of people down that highway. And I don't know if you've driven or walked that stretch. I have. This is an amazing place, an amazing photograph. Some of you may think about him in 1966 as he's beginning to turn towards poverty. He moved into a tenement house in Chicago, and I think that look on Coretta's face pretty much says everything, right, about what that experience was like. Some of you may think about him in 1968 as he told his hearers that he'd been to the mountaintop. And some of you will probably think about him the next day. There he is lying on the balcony, dying on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis as his friends are pointing up to the sky. Now, these are the most famous images of King, and they're all taken at different moments of significance in his life. And together they suggest this story of steady progress towards a tragic end. And they tell of a story of a man who pressed forward, with almost unimaginable vision, this man of courage, who, though he would not get there with us, had seen the promised land and assured us that we would get there ourselves. Then we should think about King in these ways, these kind of triumphant ways. I mean, I remember the classical era of the civil rights movement, which is really from 1954 to 1968. It was an extraordinary era of American social transformation. I mean, and it was his age. Okay, think about this, y'all. 1954, the Supreme Court strikes down Plessy versus Ferguson with its cynical doctrine of separate but equal. In 1956, the buses in Montgomery are integrated. In 1957, Eisenhower signs the Civil Rights Act into law, and the schools are integrated in Arkansas. 1960, the sit-ins in Greensboro and Atlanta and Nashville, they forced the integration of lunch counters, and Ruby Bridges integrates New Orleans school system. 1961, Freedom Rides forced the desegregation of the national bus lines. 1962, James Meredith integrates the University of Mississippi. 1963, there's a march on Washington. Schools in the state of Alabama are desegregated. 1964, King wins the Nobel Prize. Hundreds of students moved down to Mississippi in order to register African-American voters. The poll tax is outlawed. The Civil Rights Act is signed into law. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act is signed into law. Okay, this is an incredible period. It's a period, perhaps more than any other, when Americans saw like the civic possibilities of moral commitments. And when we saw this vision of what we could be. And King was not only there for that period, he was central to it. He, in fact, presided over it. And so these images that I've shown you, they tell a really important story. But they don't tell the whole story. Because as much as we're conditioned to imagine King in one of these various momentous occasions of his life, the truth is that most of his life was not lived in the high ground of progress, but in this shadowed kind of solitary wilderness space in between. The fact is that as early as 1956, in the midst of his very first public triumph in Montgomery, the wilderness began to close in upon him. And this, when I think about King, this is the image that I think about. He lived in the wilderness. See, part of this wilderness was external to the movement. It was about the resilience of white supremacy, the flagrancy of white hate, the casual nature of white violence, the blindness of his white allies. Each of these clung to him like dust. They were exhausting to him. But these internal things, as terrible as they were actually not the most difficult thing in King's life. The most difficult thing in King's life, the kind of core of his suffering, came not from forces external to the movement, but from forces internal to it. Here's what I mean. Okay. One of the marvels of King's public leadership is the degree to which at a relatively young age, like 25 or 26, his vision for what the civil rights movement should be in terms of its moral vision, its tactical approach, its social impact, its institutional form, things like that. It emerged almost wholly formed. That is, as early as 1955, King believed himself to be a part of a vision, a part of a movement that was, simply put, a vision of love in the streets. That is, King had a vision for a movement for social healing that was anchored in a Christian ethic of love. That is fundamental to understanding what he is about. That he understood this social movement to be anchored in a Christian ethic of love. And that had 5 aspects to it. Okay, and this is what we're going to talk about. It had the eyes of love, which is to say it saw human dignity in everyone. It had the works of love, which is to say it expressed itself through this nonviolent direct action. It was expressed in a community of love. That is to say it was collaborative across kind of tribal boundaries. It committed itself to the sufferings of love. It was not a therapeutic movement. It was actually a self-giving movement. And it was animated by the hope of love. That is to say, he believed that it would lead towards what he called the beloved community. Now, these 5 elements, the eyes of love, works of love, community of love, sufferings of love, and hope of love, constitute what I believe are the essence of King's faith-based vision for a civil rights movement would be. And while his understanding of each of these things actually thickened over time, my own view, which differs from some, is that he held this basic vision of love from the beginning of his public ministry until its premature end. But you have to understand that almost from the beginning, his vision of the movement experienced pressure, not just from outside, but from inside. And each of these elements were challenged. So consider his commitment to dignity. King believed that the Christian ethic of love required us to see the dignity of other people and to fundamentally humanize them in our own work. And there were people that believed that was simply empowering his enemies. And so they criticized him from the beginning for that. Or think about his commitment to nonviolence, to the works of love. King believed that nonviolent direct action was the highest civic expression of an ethic of love. It was love that propelled him forward into direct action. It was love that pulled him back from violence. But to many of his fellow movement members, this commitment felt like an emasculation of Black personhood and a capitulation of the status quo. Or think about his vision of collaboration. King struggled to build an inclusive base for the civil rights movement, a movement that included, as he put it, rich, poor, white, Black, Jew, Gentile, Protestant, Catholic. He believed all of those folks had to move together. His was not a tribal movement. But to many of his fellow movement members, this collaboration was an unnecessary burden. They rejected him for that. Think about his willingness to suffer. King talked about the fact that following Jesus in the world requires us to take up our crosses. He believed it was an inescapable and undeniable part of our witness. But to many people, this willingness to suffer simply baptized the suffering of African Americans at the hand of American racists, and empowered the violent. And he was criticized for that. Or finally, consider his desire for a beloved community, his hope. King believed that this would come to be. King renounced cynicism. He believed, he didn't know when it would happen. He didn't know that he would get there, but he believed that we as a people would get there. And there are lots of people that thought this was just kind of like preacherly affect, that this hope was unreasonable. And so you have to understand that these are not mere academic contests. These rejections of King's vision took powerful relational and institutional form, so much so that by 1965, King's vision of the civil rights movement had begun to collapse. And by the winter of 1967, just months before King was to turn towards Memphis for his final campaign, that collapse was nearly complete. And so King, look at his face again. He entered into the wilderness, and toward the end of his life, really from 65 forward, he was depressed, he was overweight, he was exhausted, he was chain smoking, he was alone. He wrestled not only with what had happened over the past years, but what would happen? What would happen now that love was being rejected? Now, this vision of King in the wilderness is critical to understand not only the last years of his life, but also what it meant for him to be committed to a vision of a faith-based social engagement, and how that commitment led him to Memphis and to why in the end he died for it. Now, as he searched for a way forward, as King really from 65 on searched for a way forward, that search eventually led him to Memphis. Now, Memphis is this kind of gritty, soulish river capital of the Mid-South. It's set on these high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi Delta. It's just kind of as close to a mountaintop as you can get in the Delta. Now, in some ways, it was an unconventional choice for King. I mean, because unlike the cities that, we conventionally associate with the civil rights movement, Montgomery, Birmingham, Selma, Jackson, Atlanta, Memphis is not a city with unusual public conflict. It wasn't always that way, of course. In May of 1866, mobs of white Memphians actually lurched through the streets of downtown, killing 45 Americans, burning 91 African-American homes, 4 African-American churches, 8 African-American schools. In 1964, this is where the kneel-ins happened, where people tried to integrate the churches. Memphis was a city in the South, but it's important to understand that during the traumatic decade of the civil rights movement that I'm talking about, from 54 to 68, really, it was largely out of the national view. Now, for white Memphians, conservatives and liberals alike, this is a point of pride, an indication that Memphis made racial progress without federal intervention. But for poor African Americans, it was actually a sign of the strength of white supremacy. A reminder that Memphis, the capital of the Mississippi Delta, was in fact just another plantation. But in other ways, Memphis was a perfect choice for King. And here's why, and this is important to understand. Lots of scholars are going to say that Memphis provided King with a platform for his building the future of the movement, that's why he went to Memphis in 1968. And it goes like this, all right? Beginning in 1965 with the Selma beatings on the bridge and the Watts riots, King had begun to broaden his concern beyond race and also begun to include other dimensions of American life. Class, the needless poverty of American economy, and militarism, the violence of the American state. It's important to understand that these issues, race, poverty, and militarism, were not discrete issues in a portfolio for King. To the contrary, they were integrated into a coherent vision of America. And I want y'all to listen to me on this. They were integrated into a coherent vision of America in which white supremacy not only judged people by the color of their skin, it also impoverished them by the structure of its economy and subdued them by the terror of its violence. Let me say that again. King's vision was of an America in which white supremacy not only judged people by the color of their skin, but also impoverished them by the structure of its economy and subdued them by the terror of its violence. And so for King, the future of the movement was a future of confronting all of these at once. And so because of this, he wanted to plan a poor people's campaign, a march of poor folks, white and black, to Washington, D.C. And his hope was to establish this tent city on the Mall of Washington, where the poor of America, white, black, immigrant, could all live together through their common life, bear witness to the failure of America, both at home and abroad. And as he began to look for a catalytic moment to galvanize this poor people's movement, he found what he was looking for in Memphis. And here's what he found. Okay, in the winter of 1968, the sanitation workers of Memphis went on strike. Now here's why. For several years, the public workers of Memphis had been in discussion with city council and the mayor about the scandalous conditions of their work and the impoverished nature of their lives. And for years, the city had rebuffed their pleas and left the city simmering. But in February of 1968, that simmering reached a boil because 2 sanitation workers, Robert Walker and Echo Cole, I'm going to make this bigger for you, were working during a lightning storm, and they sought shelter, and the white driver refused to let them get in the cab of the truck. And so they took shelter in the back of the truck where they always rode, as you can see here. And through an tragic accident, the compactor malfunctioned and pulled both of the men into the truck and killed them. Okay, that's what happened. Now, upon hearing the news, the workers determined that they had had enough. And so they began to organize, and they decided that all 1,300 of them would go on strike until the city recognized the Public Workers Union, who could advocate for their interest in employment. Okay. And so the city, not surprisingly, rejected this march. These sanitation workers created this sign. I actually have one behind me. If you ever see this sign, that's always Memphis. That's what's happening. The city rejected their pleas, and after a month of failed negotiations, Reverend James Lawson, who was one of King's friends, called King to come to Memphis and to help. Now, nobody in King's organization thought he should go to Memphis. It felt off mission. What did a local strike have to do with a National Poor People's March? It felt distracting. Why would he spend his energy there when so much needed to be done elsewhere? It felt dangerous. He was exhausted. He'd been hospitalized for fatigue. And the Memphis authorities had already said they weren't going to protect him. And so they urged him not to go, but he did go. And he went in the hopes of strengthening the sanitation workers in their movement and using that movement as a basis for his own emerging poor people's campaign. Now, this is the basic story of why King went to Memphis. And it's true as far as it goes. But my own view is that this is not the whole truth, that something else was leading him to Memphis. And what was it? My own view is that King went to Memphis because he saw there for the first time in several years the essential features of his own vision of the movement. He saw the faith-based movement come to life. In the midst of this wilderness, he saw this mountaintop before him. And that is why he went to Memphis. Now, why? First, because it is a movement rooted in this ethic of human dignity. Look at this sign. This whole thing is about human dignity. And so it was a movement driven by the eyes of love. This is one of the most important features in this movement, is that it was a movement that explicitly was anchored in the humanity of human beings and the image of God. Now, secondly, it was expressed through nonviolent direct action. These are the works of love. James Lawson was I'll show you a picture of him in a minute. He was a pastor and kind of the architect of nonviolent movement in the United States. King said he was the greatest theorist of nonviolence in the 20th century. He managed to bring these guys. These are the invaders. They're the Memphis Black nationalists. He managed to bring them into the movement and to make this a movement that was fundamentally nonviolent. And so this was another thing where King saw that even these guys were willing to work nonviolently. It was also sustained through collaborative partnership. This is really important that you know that these guys right here were a part of the movement. And just like now, the church-based movement and the nationalist movement did not work together, but they did in Memphis. And so there's this community of love. You can see it in this photograph as well. There are all these different people that are a part of this movement, and that's very important. It obviously was a movement committed to redemptive suffering, and you see that too in this picture. I'll leave that one here. And it was a movement that was consummate in this beloved community. It was a movement driven by hope. And so one of the features of this movement, this most compelling, is the degree to which its participants, in the midst of a very divisive situation, struggled to bring unity to the city. They wanted to see the beloved community come. They wanted to see what King called a new Memphis. So that it was this deeply hopeful movement. And so when King came to Memphis, he said, something is happening in Memphis. This is what he meant, that there was this faith-based movement that he hadn't seen for several years that was taking shape, and he wanted to be a part of it. Now, the history of what happened next is sadly familiar to most of us. King arrived in March of 1968 to lead a march from Claiborne Temple to City Hall. This is Claiborne Temple, where this march took place. This is right downtown Memphis. Now, it was a march of nearly 15,000 people. This is another shot of Claiborne, and it included people from all over the city. This is one of my favorite shots of the inside of Claiborne Temple. Okay, this is in March of 1968. Now, at some point when they went on this march, they walked up Beale Street, headed to downtown, and some of the invaders and some of the teenagers who idolized them began to break some storefront windows. Sorry, this is the march again. They began to break some storefront windows, and because of the crowd, it was impossible to develop a coherent plan of response. And so some continued to march, some continued to break windows and loot, and then some, as police and riot gear came in, began to run for Claiborne Temple. In the midst of it all, this unarmed 16-year-old boy, this boy right here in the white shirt, his name's Larry Payne. He was shot at point blank range by a shotgun by this officer. Now, in this moment, King is ushered out of the march. This is you can see the stress in this picture on his face, on the faces of people around him. He's ushered out of the march. He's taken into a car and into a hotel overlooking the river. And so from his room, what he can do is he can see the chaos on the streets below as police are chasing marchers and back to Claiborne Temple, where they actually broke windows and shot tear gas in. Now, the following day, I'll leave that there. Papers across the country called, basically roundly ridiculed King for the violence of the march. It meant that the faith-based movement was not real, that this wasn't peaceful, that they were only going to bring violence. And if the poor people came to DC, who knows what was going to happen. And so King was like, I have to go back to Memphis and lead a peaceful march. And because of this, against the advice of everybody except for James Lawson, he went back and he arrived on April 3rd, 1968. Now, his intention was to spend 2 days meeting with local leaders, including the invaders, to gain the assurance of the possibility of a peaceful march. And so after this long day of meetings, he went out in that evening into a thunderstorm to speak to a crowd of several thousand that were waiting for him at another church called Mason Temple. Now, during his speech that evening, it was unplanned and it was given completely without notes. And if you've seen this, you know how astonishing that is. He led his hearers through this like rhetorical history of the world, talking about its peaks of significance. And he told them that of all the times and places, he was most grateful that he lived in his own time, a time that had allowed him to witness the incredible things that had happened in cities across America. And he told them that those same things were happening in Memphis, that the old movement, this is important, he said, the old movement has taken new shape here. Something is happening in Memphis. That is what he meant, that the faith-based movement was alive again. And this is what he said. He said, he reminded them that even though there would be difficult days ahead, he was happy because in coming to Memphis, he had momentarily come out of this long wilderness and once again, seen the glorious possibilities of a faith-based movement. And this is what he said. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that tonight we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. These words are not a throwaway line. They're not a preacherly flourish, but a commentary on what he had seen, what he had at long last seen in Memphis. He'd come out of the wilderness to the city on the bluffs, and the bluffs became a mountaintop. And for there he saw the glory of the Lord. And those are the last public words he would ever speak. Now, the events surrounding King's murder have largely eclipsed the events of Memphis, the Memphis movement that drew him there. In fact, most folks, probably a lot of y'all, know that King died in Memphis. Very few people know why he went there. And his assassination is like an impact crater. It's the only thing people see. But it's not all that happened, because just days after King's murder, Coretta came back and she led a march of 25,000 people through the streets, a march that was completely silent. And the invaders stood watch and guarded people against violence. And 10 days later, the city capitulated, recognized the union. Sorry, wrong photo. Recognized the sanitation workers union, gave them what they demanded, and the men went back to work with more money in their pockets and the sense of dignity in their hearts, and the movement moved on. Now, what are we to make about that? What are we to make of these things? In some ways, it's an important story about King and his work, and it's another story. It's important about Memphis, but it's actually a story about us. Why? Because like King, the Christian church is committed to the vision of equality in our society. That is what we are called to that. And like King, we have opposition on all sides. In the culture and in the church, we have a culture that is not committed to dignity of human beings. There's violence, there's tribalism, there's self-protection. There's this orientation not towards hope, but towards winning. And we're going to be tempted to participate in that. And I suspect that a number of you are tempted to not walk the way of this love-based, faith-based civil rights movement. But I want to just urge you and say to you really plainly that if we are going to be followers of Jesus, and if we're going to in any way associate ourselves with this like classical era of the civil rights movement. What it means is to be a people and the people committed to love in this culture, committed to the triumph of love in this culture. And what does that mean? It means to have eyes of love that see the dignity in one another, and especially in our enemies, and guard that dignity. It means to be people who do the works of love, not just talking about this, but actually doing this. And that means nonviolent, direct action. It means changing stuff. It means moving and trying to repair the systems that actually needs to happen. And I know a lot of you are doing that right now. And I want to say to you that I don't know what folks are saying to you about that, but if you are doing nonviolent, direct action in the interest of love and for the sake of the neighbor, you are doing this movement. You are being faithful to this movement, even if it annoys folks around you. Okay, that's just historically true. And it's also, I want to tell you that this was a student-driven movement from 54 to 68. So it means the eyes of love. It means the works of love. It means the community of love. Look, I know that that identity politics right now is basically tearing us all apart. And for the really important and good things that identitarian categories about our identities, in terms of race, racial and ethnic, and nationalists, and all these are super important categories for us in discerning patterns of abuse and injustice, right? And helping us to identify as communities. But it is also making it difficult when those are the only categories that we have to live together as neighbors and to collaborate in democracy. And so I think one of the things that we have to do as a Christian folk is work across these tribal boundaries and figure out how we can collaborate together. And that's not easy. It's not easy. Every day of my life, it's not easy. Because I work in settings that are mostly Black with also white folks and other folks in there. And there's always tension and there's always difficulty. And we have to learn to do the work to collaborate. So the eyes of love, the works of love, the community of love. Lastly, fourth, the sufferings of love. We are a community that is called to take up the sufferings of love. This is not, the civil rights movement is not like therapeutic self-expression. It just isn't, and it just wasn't. What it is a group of people who are willing to suffer on behalf of their neighbors and on behalf of themselves and behalf of their descendants. That is what it is. We have to be the people that are willing to suffer. And lastly, we are the people of hope. We are the people that believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And that means that we have ultimate hope that even if we don't see it, and even if we can't see it on a day-to-day life, and even if we don't see it in our lifetime, we know that God loves the world, and we believe that he will raise all things that are dead again. And so I just want to encourage you, as you are taking up this brave work, many of you are taking it up, and others of you are not taking it up because you don't know how, or because you think it's not Christian or whatever. I just want to say, this is the vision that King gave for faith-based social presence. It's the eyes of love, the works of love, a community of love, the sufferings of love, and the hope of love. And I just want to urge you to give yourselves to that, because I think that that is the way that not only we can heal our society, but also the church can also heal its missional integrity in this culture. So thank you for taking time to listen to this. And I'm looking forward to discussing with you in Q&A later. So thank you.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for the question and answer session that we are organizing here in the wake of Dr. Thompson's very compelling talk for our convocation. So this is a question and answer slot. You can enter your questions into the Q&A slot at the bottom of the Zoom link and the Zoom video, and I'll be the one working along with my presidential fellow, Nate Boyer, in terms of basically sending the questions on for Dr. Thompson to answer. So start to think about some of those. I'll give you some time by posing the first question to Dr. Thompson. So to Dr. Thompson, you talked about, so let's put it this way. The title of this convocation series for this year is Prophetic Kingdom Living. I can see some strong connections between some of the discussions of how we're supposed to live as people of the kingdom of God. Strong connections between that, strong parallels between that with how you articulated King's vision. Do you care to comment on that? Can you comment on some of the overlaps with that? And particularly how that needs to be expressed today, as opposed to the civil rights movement time in the late 50s and early 60s?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that the ethic of love is the central ethic of the kingdom, and it's also one of the distinctives of the kingdom, that we're a people who are fundamentally driven by love. And so there are King didn't often use kingdom language in the sense that we use it. He had like set pieces of ways that he talked about theology that tended to emerge, but the vision that he gave here about how we view human beings and what does it mean to labor and what does it mean to collaborate and what does it mean to be willing to suffer and what does it mean to do so in the hope of the coming of God, those are all kingdom virtues and kingdom perspectives. And to the title of your series, they're also prophetic, because they're a form of distinctive encounter with the world as we're finding it right now. And so I think that that this isn't a time capsule where I'm looking back in the 1960s and saying, what worked then. The idea is what did this person say that it meant to live as a prophetic kingdom witness. And I think the same thing is true now, every bit as much as it was then.
Again, I invite any of our participants here on the webinar to send us any questions or any questions that you want to have Dr. Thompson answer. Feel free, again, just to send them either in the chat or send them in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to send those on to him. Just another thought. We're waiting for some of those to emerge. Just another thought. One sentence you said that I found intriguing, that the social orientation right now is not an orientation toward hope, but an orientation toward winning. And I thought that was a very important thing to state. Can you expound on that a little bit? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I mean, I think it's no secret that our political culture right now it is profoundly tribal, and that the interested parties seem to have primarily the goal of defeating someone else rather than, say, building a common society. And I think that ethic is kind of everywhere present. And I think that one of the actual distinctive things that we have as a people, a Christian people, is that our goal is not to win, but to love. And sometimes that gets you crowned emperor, and sometimes that gets you fed to the lions, and you don't know which it is, but that's not the point. The point is that we are called to be a people whose primary goal is the thriving of other human beings, including our enemies, which means that the notion of winning doesn't even make sense in the way that our ethical life works.
Winning doesn't make sense.
not in a community. Well, winning as conventionally understood does not make sense in a community whose calling is to give their lives for the people who are trying to defeat them. And if this makes sense. I mean, I think that that's just really important, that we understand that our goal, we live for God and we trust him, and our lives are bound up with Jesus. And I don't have to win over my enemies. In fact, I'm commanded not to try to win over my enemies, but to love my enemies, and trust that God makes things whole. And that's I do not think that much of the Christian church in America has sufficiently, let me understate it a little bit. I don't think that much of the Christian church in America has sufficiently internalized the ethic of self-sacrificial love.
As opposed to power, right? And being in control.
It's about instrumental power and about control. And it's transparently about that. It's transparently about that. And when you hear Christians saying, I want to, for example, put this person in office because they're going to protect my interests and the church and whatever, I'm like, at this point, I don't recognize this as a Christian political ethic.
So we do have some questions coming in. Thank you very much. So here's a question. Looking forward to your forthcoming book, Reparations, A Christian Call to Repentance and Repair. What is a special lesson that you've learned throughout the process of writing this book, and what do you mainly hope readers will get out of it?
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, so a couple of things I'll say, and I'll try not to ramble here. One of them is, let's see, what have I'll say what I'm hoping that readers will get out of it first. There was once a time in American evangelicalism when the words race and racial reconciliation were not comfortable terms. They're not things that people talked about. That's not true anymore. That's not to say that we're embodying all these things faithfully, but it is to say that the language of race and racial reconciliation is in the mouths of much of the Christian church. But the language of white supremacy and the language of reparations is not in a lot of the Christian church, is not in the mouths of the Christian church. And so just like there was work done to make race and racial reconciliation utterable phrases, I am working to put the language of white supremacy and reparations in the mouth of the Christian church as a reasonable thing to talk about. I understand that what I mean, you got to understand, I'm a white dude from South Carolina, and so when people talk here, I've written a book on reparations, it's like, what are you talking about? That's not a surprise to me. I think it's because the Christian church has not, broadly conceived, especially in the evangelical branch, has not done enough work on this issue. And so one of the things I'm hoping to accomplish is to be increasingly normalize the reparations conversation, which now feels radioactive. And I just think we need to normalize it. So that's one of the things I'm hoping for. I think in one of the things I've learned, I think I had not fully reckoned with how much reparations is a part of the Christian ethical tradition, especially the Reformed Protestant tradition. If you read, because remember, the Reformed Protestant tradition is a tradition that it has a lot to say about the law, meaning the moral law, especially. And if you're reading the Puritan tradition, or if you're reading the Reformers, all these dudes are writing commentaries on the 10 Commandments. Like, they all did that. And when they write on the 8th commandment about theft, every single one of them has a restitution ethic, a multi-generational restitution ethic. When you steal something from somebody, if your grandpa stole it from somebody and you got it, you've got to give it back to them. These are the Puritans. Now, were they applying it to the slave trade? Of course not, because they didn't think it was theft, but it was theft. And so if we use their ethic, the ethic of theft, and I mean, every 6-year-old in the Christian church knows what you do when you steal something. Okay, you give it back. This is not complicated. And so I learned that the real way that Christianity can help in this conversation is because we have an ethic that directly addresses the question of theft. And so I think that we can be really useful in that. And I don't think I fully had I mean, you know, because I'm a civil rights scholar by training, I had not fully internalized how deeply embedded this ethic of restitution is inside of the Christian church, even if you're not personally culpable. Even if you're not personally culpable. There are two major theft stories in the New Testament. One of them is Zacchaeus' story. This is where somebody is himself culpable. He's participating in a state-sanctioned way of extracting money from other people. And so Zacchaeus, of course, you know, he says, I give back 4 times what I stole, and I give half my possessions to the poor. He wasn't just freaking out there and going all Ron Sider on everybody. What he was doing was actually quoting numbers. Okay, he's quoting the Hebrew ethic of restitution. But the other theft story in the New Testament is the Good Samaritan story, where this person comes upon a theft in which they were not complicit, and they do exactly the same thing that Zacchaeus did. Why? Because that is what Christian folk do. We come upon a theft of people who have had things taken from them. Whether we were involved in it or not is not the point in Christian ethics. It isn't. And so I think that this is that was super exciting to me to realize that the breadth of the Christian tradition's ability to engage with theft in which one is and is not culpable. And I think that was really, really important. sorry to ran on about it, but that was exciting for me.
Yeah, but I can see how that is challenging thinking, particularly when there's a way in which we can sort of generationally disconnect ourselves from our ancestry and say we have nothing to do with it. I mean, that's some heavy things to chew on.
Well, it is. I mean, and I think a lot of talk right now is predicated upon the illusion that the slave economy and the current economy are different economies.
Mhm.
They're not. They're the same economy. They're the same, and they are predicated upon the other. And one of the things that I do in this book is basically talk about how the ways in which that's true. And so I basically think that one of my deep concerns is that so much of what I hear from Christian evangelical leaders with respect to this is an attempt to self-exonerate. And that feels fundamentally not having anything to do with the Good Samaritan to me. The Good Samaritan story is disquietingly silent on matters of culpability.
Yeah.
But it is very clear on matters of responsibility.
Indeed. So let me ask a different question, and I know that a couple of people have asked this, particularly because of the location, your particular location, and I'm speaking of that not just geographically, but just in the midst of this social moment. What is your advice to someone eager to engage in a conversation with someone they know might meet them with disagreement? And I think that's an important question for our community right now. And so it would be good to hear your thinking on that.
What is my advice to somebody who wants to engage with somebody that might disagree with them?
Yes. Someone they know might meet them with disagreement.
Like that's going to happen at every Thanksgiving table in America? Is that what you mean? I mean, look, I will say this. I think that, and I'm maybe and probably wrong on this. I spend almost none of my time trying to engage with people in discussion who I know or don't share my basic assumptions. I don't. And it's not because I don't care what they think. I read a lot of those people, so I can learn from them. But I feel like what we most need right now is not people who can win arguments or something like that, but people who can just bear witness by doing the work. I think that's super important. So if you want to engage with somebody who disagrees with you, I don't know if it's like for sport or if it's for learning or for whatever. I just think the context right now is so fraught, and that the ethics of the discursive ethics of social media have so like penetrated and permeated our personalities that people don't listen to each other very often. And so I tend to think that what I'm mostly trying to do is figure out how to do work that bears witness to this, rather than getting in a bunch of conversations about it. Like if somebody asked me if I would debate somebody on stage, the answer is no. Why? Because I'm scared of that or whatever? No, because I think it's stupid. Because I in the sense of like, ultimately, I think a lot of this is wasting our time. And so what I would rather do is when people say, well, you're a white guy that doesn't care about race, rather than me getting in some big chat about it with them, what I'm trying to do is take them to the Underground Railroad Memorial that I'm building and say, or take them to Claiborne Temple that I helped to restore, and do it that way. Now, I'm probably not answering the question that you're asking. I'm trying.
Well, yeah. So let me push back on you a little bit, because, we have some churches, obviously, where there are folks of differing opinions. We have some households, as you implied with the Thanksgiving statement. We have institutions. I mean, our institution right now, I think, is a context in which we have folks of very widely differing opinions. And yet, one of the values that we say here are important is the value and ethic of shalom, in which relationships matter. And so the ethic of listening and the ethic of at least upholding the dignity of somebody you disagree with by at least let's hear what they have to say without my just standing there saying, I'm just waiting to hear what you have to say to load up for bear so that I can counteract against you. What would that discipline look like in your view? I mean,
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, if the goal was to listen and to pursue a relationship, I think what I was trying to respond to is the fact that I have some deep ambivalence about the efficacy of public discourse in this moment. That's largely what I'm trying to say. Now,
well, if you don't mind my interrupting for a second, the idea that this should be a free marketplace of ideas and the best thing wins. So here we hear that winning thing again, which I don't know if that's helpful for relationship, particularly in a community like.
Yeah, so that's what I was responding to. But I think listening more carefully now, I do also have relationships with people with whom I disagree, and I try to listen to them, and I say, okay, and I try to understand what are the circumstances under which they could think what they think. The thing that scares me the most about what is when I find myself going, I have no idea how you think what you think. I don't understand you at all, because when somebody becomes fundamentally unintelligible to me, they become less human to me. And that's very dangerous, ethically speaking. And so I feel like I do try to listen. I do try to learn. I try to think, okay, what are the conditions under which they would be thinking what they're thinking, and how can I try to see it from their perspective? That doesn't mean that I agree with it, but that feels like a moral practice to try to put myself in the position of another person. So I think listening is very important. I am not confident that I don't think I have a lot of confidence in the art of persuasion right now. And I think in terms of discussion, I think that I would rather cook somebody a meal and talk to them about their lives and communicate my love for them, or let them have an experience like at Claiborne Temple or coming to the musical or something like that. Then, but I don't know that I'm being helpful right now, so I should probably stop talking.
No, I think we're all in that place of really trying to discern, what is a way forward with our lives and with our relationships in a way that really promotes hope, right, and brings about a proper witness in the end. A couple of personal questions, if you don't mind. Somebody has asked, what would you consider your greatest your greatest passion to be? And maybe you can intertwine that with another question, where somebody asks, what passage of scripture has been especially meaningful to you in this current season?
Let me think about that. I think in terms of the passage that's been the most meaningful to me is the Annunciation, where Mary learns that she has this child and how she responds, because it reminds me on a daily basis that God has made his life with us, and we have the opportunity to nurture that life, and to have hope in that life, that life brings justice and hope. And, there's one of my favorite writers is this Catholic theologian, and what he says, every day in the Christian life is a reprise of the Annunciation, which means like every day we get to wake and say, again, the life of God is within me. Blessed be the Lord, and let's move forward. And that passage, and particularly Mary, Mary's way of nurturing that life and submitting to that will, I think have been very, with no control and no sense of what her life was going to be. I love the utter absence of control in the way that she responds. And the I'm on this journey with God who is within me, and this is my life. I think that's been very beautiful, and is daily. I'm daily cognizant of that. My passions, I don't know. I mean, I think my fundamental passion is hospitality. and that everything I'm doing is trying to create spaces where we can find each other. Whether it is, I mean, I'm opening a cocktail bar in Philadelphia right now that's based in the history of Black cocktails, because there's not anything like that in America. And, why? Because I'm like a cocktail guy? Well, not, I mean, yes, but no. I want a space where people can sit together, and that the big, massive portrait of Harriet Tubman on the wall, and the bar that was taken from a formerly enslaved man named Tom Bullock, and who published a book called The Ideal Bartender. This book right here in 1917. Nobody knows who this guy is, but he like invented major stuff in America. He's this formerly enslaved man. We're using his menu. And I want people to sit down and think they came in to get a gin and tonic or whatever they came in, and instead they're going to have this whole experience about learning about African American cultural history, and they're going to find themselves and find each other in that. My whole life is about creating spaces for people to find each other. That's what Claiborne Temple is. That's what the musical is. That's what this memorial is that I'm working on. That's what the cocktail bar is. It's all about finding these creating spaces where people can be honored and can be so together.
So how do you battle with exhaustion when engaging in this type of work?
Yeah, so I'm pretty discouraged right now, honestly. I think the weight of it is this. I worked for most of y'all have never even heard of me, and there's a reason for that, because I'm not like trying to be the woke white guy who's like going on tour. Okay, I'm actually living and working in Black spaces, or in kind of mixed spaces, or in white spaces where I'm creating spaces for Black leadership. And every single Black friend and colleague that I have is completely exhausted right now. And they all want to quit their jobs, and they all want to stop working in predominantly white institutions, or they all want to stop having to interface with white funders, and they all want to stop. They're just like tired of it. And I understand. And I think I'm primarily discouraged, and my exhaustion comes from my inability to fix that. I can't. There's like, I don't know what to do. I just sort of bear this with them. And so I'm discouraged by and exhausted. I don't know that you can avoid exhaustion, frankly. I don't know. I think you can avoid sin. And I think you can avoid ridiculous or irresponsible forms of self-harm. But our mission is to like roll back or repair a society from 4 centuries of exploitative, presumptive mythology that has had like profoundly damaging effects on every human being that lives inside of it. I don't know how you can not do that, and how you can take that work up and not be exhausted, And so I just have to I have to like exercise, and I have to take breaks, and I have to like go on walks and throw frisbee with my son, and I have to decide I'm not going to read any more about white supremacy tonight. I'm going to watch The Crown, or which is itself about white supremacy. Anyway, so I think that I'm just having to pace myself and find my life in Jesus.
Shifting gears a little bit, and I just want to go back again to, your passions in creating spaces. So clearly, you've done other very interesting work, and so I think one of our viewers has picked up on that, and so he asks, it looks like you played the mayor in the musical Union that you co-created.
Yeah.
Memphis, I presume, right? So that's the context for this.
Yeah.
So if so, what was it like to play the bad guy when you studied Dr. King so much?
So that's interesting. Yeah. So I played the white racist mayor in an all-Black cast. And I wrote this musical with a rapper named Sho Baraka. Some of y'all may know Sho. So Sho and I are good friends, and we wrote this musical together. I originally was not planning to be in the musical. I didn't want to do that. And Sho and the other production team members said, we think that you should do this. Not only do you have the ability and the gifts to do it, not only did you write all this music, but we think that you need to model for white people what we need white people to do, which is be willing to identify with a racist He's like, most of the white folks that we know want to pretend that that is somebody else. And you have to do this humiliating thing of getting on a stage in front of thousands of people and being this like racist. And that is a moral act. It's a willingness to say, this is part of me too. I don't get to have a distance from this. I have to acknowledge this. And that was, it was weird because like, you know, here I wrote this play and the cast members had a hard time because I played this and I was like, I'm going to play it. I got to play it for the success of this play. And they were just like, you know, I was the like racist. And it's like hard to like take a break from that and be like, all right, guys, let's go hang out. You know, I mean, you've heard about actors getting in spaces where it's like totally weird for them for like 6 months and their wives don't even know. I wasn't embodying it in that sense, but it was more like I could tell that the relational distance between the cast and this was bringing up a lot of pain in them, this story. And I was like, even though I wrote this to like, you know, be an act of healing and to tell this story, I was the local symbol of all that pain. And that was hard. It's hard, but is also important.
Looking at a couple more questions here. Another person asks or says that they're interested to hear more about the current progress and status of the Underground Railroad Memorial Project that Dr. Thompson is associated with.
Okay, thank you. So there's the organization is called Voices Underground, and that's you can look it up at vuproject.org. And our goal is to promote the African American cultural history in this place called Chester County, Pennsylvania, which was the that area of the country is to America's first civil rights movement, which is the abolitionist and Underground Railroad movement. It is to that what Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham are to the second one. But yet there are no memorials there. Like if you drive through, what you see are like Mennonite and Amish farms, and you see, you know, Andrew Wyeth and the DuPonts and all that that's what you see. But in fact, it was like a central place for African American cultural history. And so we started this organization in order to tell those stories and to promote them. And the name Voices Underground comes from Genesis 4, where God says to Cain, you know, brother, and he said, you know, basically, who cares? And God says, I heard your brother's blood crying out from the ground. And that really is the first justice passage for me. And what it says is that justice consists in part of listening to those voices that violence have buried and making their stories heard again. And that is really what's driving me right now. And so to do that, we do research. So we started this research institute at Lincoln University, which is the first historically Black college in America. We also do public experiences. So I'm the creative director of the Juneteenth Festival for Chester County, PA, which is we're turning into a Black Arts and Film Festival. And also I'm creating this cocktail bar, and we do secret suppers and Underground Railroad sites with Black chefs from Philadelphia. And so we do these public experiences. But the last one is the memorialization project. And so I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Stevenson's lynching memorial. Well, the goal is to create something on that scale. Meaning when I talk about a memorial, we're not talking about a statue. We're talking about a multi-acre contemplative experience. And we're trying to actually create a pilgrimage route that can go from the eastern shore of Maryland, where Harriet Tubman was, up and will go to the memorial. So that we're mapping into a trail system. So right now what we've done is we're in site selection mode. We've visited 5 potential sites. We've hired a major landscape architect firm, the people that did the Flight 93 Memorial, actually, in Hudson Yards in New York City. And they're doing site assessments for us right now to figure out like which of these sites makes the most sense. And then in the next summer, we're going to have what we call a design congress, which is we're having kind of people who work in this memorial space and in this race space come together for 3 days to like put the design principles together. And then we're going to have a committee we're going to request proposals from artists from all over the world who would like to design this. And so the goal is to have it open in 5 to 7 years. So that's where we are right now.
This is what you're articulating is a very important and creative use of creative abilities, right, to continue to advance the discussions of the kingdom, basically in terms of justice and making things right, but also recovering stories. I'm a historian, right? I mean, so recovering old stories. I mean, that's supposedly what we do, but taking it one step further to also address just the brokenness of the past and to find ways to heal and restore those things, right? I mean,
yeah, that's right. And I think that's part of what I was trying to get at when I was flubbing through that question earlier about how to talk to people that disagree with us.
Yeah.
What I was trying to get at is, at some point, look, I was a pastor preaching regularly for 20 years. And I realized, even as hard as I've worked and even as clear as I am, and I'm like talking about all this stuff to my congregation, there's something broken in the American imagination. Like when I just start talking about race, and when I start talking about race, white supremacy, there's like a switch that turns off. Like people, it's just like, wah, wah, wah. They can't hear me because all of a sudden they've decided that I'm a liberal or I'm social gospel or I'm a Marxist or whatever the filter is. It doesn't matter where any of that's true or not. It just shuts off. And so I thought, I can continue to go at this directly in a left brain mode and try to argue people into alignment, which is not going to work, or preach them into it, which is just like a one-sided argument, right? Or I can go right brain. And that was a very conscious decision that I made 5 years ago. I'm good at left brain, right? Did a PhD, but I ended up realizing I don't think that the left brain thing is what I think. The American imagination is broken, and so what we have to do is we have to heal the American racial imagination. Well, how do you heal imaginations? You don't do it through lectures. You do it through experiences. And so what I decided to do was I can either tell people about the history of lynching, the 4,000 lynching victims in America. I can give a lecture about that, or I can get people in a van and drive to Selma and create dinners for them and show them the memorial in Montgomery, and then let them take them to dinner afterwards. And that is what my career is now. It is essentially saying, how do I create these aesthetic experiential spaces for people to be transformed? Because the things that we're doing, we've actually inoculated ourselves to left brain kind of approaches, right? Mm-hmm. And that's like something that's very weird that I couldn't figure out how to address it or how to even name it, but I could see it. And so when I left pastoral ministry, the first thing I did was I wrote a musical. The second thing I did was I helped to build a memorial to the sanitation workers. And actually, let me just show you all this real quick, if you don't mind, Dr. Rowe. I think this will give you an example of the kind of thing that we're trying to do here. 1 second. So I'm going to show you all just a few pictures, and you'll get a sense of the direction my work has now gone.
While you're looking that up, I know that there are certain members of my family who are laughing out loud right now because I'm the most left-brain member of my family. Everybody else in my family is very heavily into expressive arts, and they're doing much of the same thing. And you know what? You're 100% spot on. But please, to your.
Yeah, so this is Claiborne Temple. I showed you all this in the earlier lecture. You see the I'm a Man signs. This is Claiborne Temple when I first went into it in 2016.
Wow. So that's what happened over this time. It just decayed like this. Wow.
Yeah, the AME couldn't afford it. They couldn't afford it when the Memphis economy fell apart. And so they just boarded it up, and the city was about to tear it down. And this white dude bought it and then realized what he had. He bought it for $50,000 because he was a developer. Then he realized, wait a minute, I have something of massive historical significance. So he called me just because he didn't know any black folks, to be honest with you. He called he's like, well, you're a white guy that knows black stuff, so I'll just call you. And he called me and I was like, Lord, you've got a serious thing on your hands here. I will help you build a team of black leadership and I'll help you tell this story. And so what we did is this is another, kind of example. What we did is we did an initial restoration. We put in a new floor. We braced the building with money from a white church. We put in this fence. We reactivated the space and opened it up for the community. This is in the poorest neighborhood in the entire state of Tennessee. It's right downtown Memphis, a block from Beale Street. And so now there's a church that meets in it. People have their weddings in it. It's now closed actually because we raised the money for restoration. But then we built a memorial. We're like, it's not just a building. We have to tell this story. So there's this I Am a Man Plaza. Again, this used to be a vacant lot in this neighborhood. And now it's a place where people shoot their wedding videos and their rap videos and their graduation pictures. Those are the words to King's last speech that are on that memorial. And then in the wall in the back, those are all the sanitation workers' names. And so this is the kind of example of what I'm talking about in the sense of we have to create these experiences. And that's why the musical happened, because I thought, well, people can only see the memorial if they come to Memphis. Why don't I take the story of sanitation workers to Greensboro? Why don't I take it to Raleigh? Why don't I take it to, Nashville, Birmingham? And that's really what happened until COVID came and killed all of our shows.
I was going to ask about that, and maybe that's something for another time. Hopefully, we can talk about the effects of COVID, but maybe we can end. You know what? Maybe we can end on that. I mean, I'm going to ask you just if you have any final words to say, but let's just deal with it head on. We're in the middle of COVID, so even all those things you talked about, creating spaces, relies upon people engaging one another, and we know that that's one of the biggest casualties over the past few months has been the capacity for human connection in that way. So how does the work continue in light of that? How do we continue to do that in this space? We've heard good news about vaccines and everything else. So, our prayer is that things come back soon, but still, we're in this now, right? And it's costing us. Your thoughts on that, your recommendations, and how you continue to persist to make that type of meaningful, particularly right brain connection during this time?
Yeah. So, I feel like I see this as a time of preparation. So like what I did when COVID shut everything down is I went back in left brain mode because I couldn't see people, and I wrote a book on reparations. I wrote that during the first quarantine. But I also am preparing for the time when we can see each other again. This is not idle time. So, I feel like a lot of the work that we have to do right now is to figure out how to put things in place where people can find each other. So I'm going to show you another thing. We had an event last week. This is in the cocktail space. Everybody had to get tested before they came to this. These are our core partners. This is inside the space that I'm turning into this cocktail bar. It's in the basement of an old abolitionist dairy, a dairy that was owned by an abolitionist family. It's this gorgeous space. We're trying to create, but my work right now is to I'm creating this space so that when COVID is done, whatever that means, that people can come back into this space. That's why we're creating the Juneteenth Festival. We're creating these pilgrimage routes. We're doing all this now when nobody can use them, so that in anticipation of an unseen future when they can. And so I don't think we should be idle at this point. I think we need to be using this time creatively. Then also, I just feel like I'm having to a lot of what I'm doing right now is what everybody else is doing. I'm just checking in on my friends. I'm just trying to stay honest and build close relationships but I do think that one of the most important things we can do right now is use this time of relative silence and relative inactivity and relatively low interaction to create a space for the time when we can be together again. It's like your grandma's doing right now. Okay. You're not at Thanksgiving yet, but you know, she's already got those sweet potatoes going. You know that she's doing this. That is what I'm in that mode right now, which is like, I see that a table's coming. Ain't nobody there yet, but I'm in the kitchen doing all this stuff in anticipation. And I think that if we could be a community that anticipates that, and when the world wakes up again, comes outside and sees, oh my gosh, they decorated my yard. You know, I mean, this sees that we've been active, ready to host. That's the thing that's exciting to me about this.
Dr. Thompson, thank you so very, very much for your offering of time to us, the offering of your mind, your heart. You've given us a lot to think about. I particularly like your expression of hope of, you know what, I'm using this time to get ready for when we're able to come together again. I think that's an important note to end on. This will not last forever. We won't go back to the way things were. I mean, let's just give that up. But I think at the same time, this is not going to last forever. So how are we getting ready for when we're going to engage fully in the way we're designed to? So, but thanks again for your time with us. Folks, thank you for joining us in this Q&A session. We have recorded this, and I think there's just too much goodies left in here just to leave it on the cutting floor. So we will attach it as part of the overall convocation a video that will go up within the next few days. And thank you all for joining us. And once again, Dr. Thompson, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. God bless you guys. See you later.
God bless you all.
All right,
well.
Bye.
Keep well. Take care.